Baby fox found by child. The unexpected friendship that follows is heartwarming. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The forest was alive with the gentle hum of life, a symphony of chirping birds, rustling leaves, and the distant sound of a brook winding its way through the undergrowth. To an adult, the woods might seem vast and imposing, but to 10-year-old Samuel, it was his sanctuary. The towering pines and soft carpet of fallen leaves had been his playground since he could remember, a world where he could let his imagination run wild. That afternoon, the sunlight dappled the forest floor, casting patches of gold that danced with every breeze. Samuel adjusted his wide-brimmed straw hat, the one his grandfather had given him last summer, and wandered down the familiar trail. In his hand, he clutched a small basket meant for gathering pine cones and the occasional wildflower. He loved these solo adventures, the quiet of the woods broken only by his own footsteps. But today, something was different. Samuel paused mid-step, his ears perking up at a faint sound, high-pitched and plaintive, almost like a cry. It was faint, easily lost among the forest's natural chorus, but it tugged at him. His brow furrowed as he turned his head, trying to pinpoint the source. There it was again, a tiny whimper, like a plea for help. "Hello," he called out, his voice soft but steady. He wasn't afraid of the woods, but something about the sound sent a shiver up his spine. It wasn't human, he was sure of that. Maybe a bird caught in a tangle of branches? Or a rabbit in distress? He stepped off the trail, his boots crunching against the underbrush as he followed the sound. It grew louder with each step, guiding him like a thread through the trees. His heart quickened, a mix of curiosity and concern driving him forward. Finally, he spotted it. A small bundle of orange and white fur nestled at the base of an old oak tree. Samuel froze, his breath catching in his throat as he took in the sight. It was a baby fox. The tiny creature lay curled up, its body trembling as it let out another pitiful whimper. Its coat was matted with dirt, and its thin frame spoke of days without proper food. One of its small paws was tucked awkwardly beneath it, the fur around it caked with dried mud and what looked like blood. Samuel's heart ached at the sight. He had seen foxes before, darting through the woods with their sleek coats and bushy tails. They were usually cautious, keeping their distance from humans. But this one was different. It was vulnerable, its wide, frightened eyes locking onto his as if begging for help. "Hey there," Samuel said softly, crouching down a few feet away. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, not wanting to startle the little fox. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The fox let out another whimper, its tiny body trembling as it tried to shift away. Samuel noticed the way its injured paw dragged limply, and his heart sank further. It was hurt, scared, and completely alone. He set his basket down and reached into his pocket, pulling out a handkerchief his mother had insisted he carry. It wasn't much, but it was clean and soft. Slowly, he inched closer, his voice a constant murmur of reassurance. "It's okay, little one," he said, his tone as gentle as the breeze. "I just want to help." The fox's wide eyes watched his every move, its tiny body coiled like a spring ready to flee. But when Samuel stopped just a foot away, the creature seemed to relax ever so slightly. Its whimpers quieted, though its trembling didn't stop. Samuel extended the handkerchief slowly, letting it rest on the ground between them. The fox sniffed it cautiously, its tiny nose twitching. Encouraged, Samuel reached into his basket and pulled out a small piece of bread he had packed for himself. He broke off a bit and placed it on the handkerchief. The fox hesitated, its wide eyes flicking between the boy and the offering. Hunger eventually won out, and it leaned forward, its tiny teeth tearing into the bread with quick, desperate bites. "That's it," Samuel said softly, a smile tugging at his lips. "You're a brave little thing, aren't you?" As the fox ate, Samuel took the opportunity to examine it more closely. Its injured paw looked swollen, the fur around it matted with grime. He knew it needed more help than he could offer here in the woods. The thought of leaving it behind made his chest tighten. "I'm going to take you home," he said, his voice firm with determination. "You'll be safe there, I promise." The fox paused its eating, its wide eyes meeting his again. There was something in its gaze, a mix of fear and trust, as if it understood his words. Carrying the fox back home was no easy task. Samuel wrapped it gently in his handkerchief, cradling it against his chest as he navigated the uneven forest floor. The fox was light, its fragile body barely registering as weight in his arms, but its presence felt enormous. Every step was taken with care, every sound met with a glance over his shoulder. When he finally emerged from the woods and stepped into the clearing where his family's small cottage stood, relief washed over him. The familiar sight of the weathered wooden walls and the scent of fresh bread baking inside made him feel grounded. His mother was on the porch, her hands dusted with flour as she worked dough on a small wooden table. She looked up as Samuel approached, her eyes widening at the sight of the bundle in his arms. "Samuel, what on earth?" she began, setting the dough aside as she wiped her hands on her apron. "It's a baby fox, Mama," Samuel said quickly, his voice tinged with urgency. "It's hurt. I couldn't just leave it there." His mother's expression softened as she stepped closer, her eyes scanning the tiny creature nestled against his chest. "Oh, the poor thing," she murmured, her tone filled with concern. "Let's bring it inside." Together, they worked to make the fox comfortable. His mother brought a soft towel and a shallow bowl of warm water, while Samuel found an old blanket to line a small wooden crate. The fox was hesitant at first, its wide eyes darting between them as they worked. But Samuel's soothing words and gentle hands eventually calmed it. As his mother cleaned the fox's injured paw, Samuel sat close by, his hands resting on the edge of the crate. "Will it be okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His mother glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "It's hard to say," she admitted, "but you did the right thing bringing it here. We'll do everything we can." Samuel nodded, his gaze fixed on the fox. "I'm going to take care of you," he said softly. "No matter what." The fox let out a faint chirp, its tiny body relaxing against the blanket. For the first time since he'd found it, Samuel felt a glimmer of hope. The little fox was nestled comfortably in the crate, its tiny body barely stirring as it dozed off. Samuel couldn't take his eyes off it, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and concern. He'd never cared for an animal before, not like this. Sure, there were the barn cats that came and went, and the occasional bird he and his father had nursed back to health, but this was different. This fox needed him completely, and that thought filled him with both excitement and responsibility. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting the room in warm golden light, his mother handed him a small bowl of milk. "Here," she said gently, "try feeding it this. It might be too young to eat much else." Samuel nodded, carefully dipping the edge of a cloth into the milk and bringing it to the fox's mouth. It stirred slightly, its little nose twitching as it caught the scent. With a soft whimper, it began to lap at the milk, its tiny tongue flicking against the cloth. "There you go," Samuel murmured, his voice low and soothing. "That's it. You're safe now." His mother watched from the corner of the room, a soft smile playing on her lips. Samuel had always been a tender-hearted boy, but seeing him like this, so focused, so gentle, filled her with a quiet sense of pride. "What are you going to name it?" she asked after a moment. Samuel glanced up, his brow furrowing thoughtfully. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "It's got to be something special." "Well," his mother said, moving to sit beside him, "sometimes the right name comes to you when you least expect it. Just give it time." Samuel nodded, his gaze returning to the fox. Its tiny eyes were half-lidded, its movements slowing as it drifted back to sleep. He reached out to brush a stray bit of fur from its face, his fingers trembling slightly at the fragile warmth beneath them. "You're going to be okay," he whispered, more to himself than to the fox. "I promise." The days that followed were a whirlwind of care and learning. The fox, who Samuel eventually named Rusty because of its bright orange fur, began to show signs of improvement under his watchful care. Its injured paw healed slowly but surely, thanks to his mother's careful cleaning and bandaging. Its once thin frame filled out as it gained strength, and its fur grew softer and glossier with each passing day. Rusty quickly became a fixture in their small home, following Samuel wherever he went. The two were inseparable. Wherever Samuel was, Rusty was never far behind. Whether it was helping his mother in the kitchen, tending to the chickens in the yard, or exploring the edge of the woods, Rusty was always there, his small paws patting softly against the ground. The bond between them deepened in ways Samuel hadn't expected. Rusty seemed to sense his emotions, chirping softly when Samuel was upset and nuzzling close to him during moments of quiet. Samuel, in turn, found himself opening up to Rusty in ways he couldn't with anyone else. He'd whisper his thoughts and dreams to the little fox, feeling a sense of comfort in its steady presence. But not everyone shared Samuel's enthusiasm for Rusty. One crisp afternoon, as Samuel and Rusty played near the edge of the woods, a voice called out from the trail. "What are you doing with that fox, boy?" Samuel turned to see Old Man Fletcher, the gruff farmer who lived just down the road, standing with his arms crossed. His weathered face was etched with disapproval, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Rusty. "It's my fox," Samuel said firmly, stepping protectively in front of Rusty. "I found him in the woods. He was hurt." Fletcher snorted, shaking his head. "A fox isn't a pet, boy. It's a wild animal. It belongs in the woods, not in your house." "He's not wild anymore," Samuel shot back, his voice trembling with defiance. "He's part of our family now." The older man's expression darkened. "You'd better be careful, boy," he said, his tone low and warning. "A fox is still a fox. One day it'll turn on you. Mark my words." With that, he turned and stalked off, leaving Samuel standing there with a knot of anger and fear in his chest. Rusty let out a soft chirp, pressing against his leg as if sensing his unease. "Don't listen to him," Samuel murmured, scooping Rusty up in his arms. "You're not like that. I know you're not." Despite Fletcher's warning, Samuel's bond with Rusty only grew stronger. But his words lingered in the back of Samuel's mind, casting a shadow over their otherwise happy days. What if Fletcher was right? What if Rusty's instincts one day overcame the trust they had built? Those doubts came to a head one evening, when Samuel took Rusty into the woods for one of their usual walks. The forest was peaceful, the air crisp and filled with the scent of pine. Rusty darted ahead, his tiny paws skimming over the fallen leaves as he explored. But then, something changed. Rusty froze mid-step, his body tensing as his ears swiveled toward a distant sound. Samuel followed his gaze, his heart skipping a beat when he saw what had caught Rusty's attention. A larger fox, sleek and wild, was watching them from a distance, its amber eyes gleaming in the fading light. It let out a low, guttural bark, its body coiled with readiness. Rusty chirped in response, his small body quivering as he took a cautious step forward. Samuel's chest tightened with fear. "Rusty, no," he said quickly, reaching out to grab him. But Rusty hesitated, his gaze flicking between the wild fox and Samuel. It was as if he was caught between two worlds, the one he had been born into and the one he had chosen. "Rusty, please," Samuel said, his voice trembling. "Come back." For a moment, everything hung in the balance. The wild fox barked again, its tone sharp and commanding. Rusty's tiny frame trembled, his instincts pulling him toward the call of the wild. But then he turned back to Samuel. With a soft chirp, Rusty padded back to his side, nuzzling against his leg as if to say, "I'm here." Relief washed over Samuel, his knees nearly buckling as he knelt down to scoop Rusty into his arms. "You scared me," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't ever do that again." Rusty let out a soft purr, his small body warm and steady against Samuel's chest. As they made their way back home, Samuel's heart was filled with a new sense of clarity. Fletcher might never understand, and the wild might always call to Rusty, but their bond was stronger than anything. Rusty had chosen him, and that was all that mattered. The forest faded behind them as Samuel carried Rusty home, the little fox nestled against his chest. The encounter with the wild fox had shaken him more than he cared to admit. He couldn't stop replaying the moment Rusty had hesitated, caught between instinct and the bond they shared. But the fact that Rusty had chosen to return to him, that meant something. It meant everything. By the time they reached the cottage, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep hues of orange and purple. Samuel's mother was on the porch, a lantern in hand, her expression softening with relief when she saw them. "There you are," she said, stepping down to meet them. "I was starting to worry." "Sorry, Mama," Samuel said, his voice quiet. "We got caught up in the woods." She glanced at Rusty, who was blinking sleepily in Samuel's arms. "Is everything all right?" Samuel hesitated, the memory of the wild fox flickering in his mind. "Yeah," he said finally, offering a small smile. "We're fine." His mother studied him for a moment, her brow furrowing slightly, but she didn't press. Instead, she reached out to scratch behind Rusty's ears, her touch gentle and reassuring. "Come inside," she said. "It's getting cold." That night, as Rusty curled up at the foot of Samuel's bed, the boy lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The room was quiet, save for the soft rustle of the wind outside and the steady rhythm of Rusty's breathing. But Samuel's thoughts were anything but still. He couldn't shake the feeling that the wild fox would return, or worse, that Rusty might one day feel the pull of the forest too strongly to resist. The idea of losing him sent a pang of fear through Samuel's chest, tightening like a vice. But then he looked down at Rusty, who was stretched out on his blanket, his tiny paws twitching as he dreamed. The sight filled Samuel with a fierce sense of protectiveness. Rusty wasn't just a fox to him, he was family, and family didn't abandon each other. With that thought, Samuel closed his eyes, letting sleep claim him. The next morning, Samuel woke to the sound of Rusty chirping softly at the window. The little fox was perched on the sill, his tail swishing as he watched the forest beyond. Samuel sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as he swung his legs over the side of the bed. "What are you looking at, buddy?" he asked, crossing the room to join Rusty. The forest was bathed in early morning light, the trees casting long shadows across the ground. It was peaceful, quiet, but Samuel couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. The encounter with the wild fox lingered in his mind, a reminder of the fragile line they walked between two worlds. Rusty chirped again, his nose pressed against the glass as if longing to be outside. Samuel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "All right," he said, "let's go for a walk." The forest felt different that day, quieter, heavier. Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though every time he glanced over his shoulder, there was nothing but trees and shadows. Rusty, however, seemed unbothered. He darted ahead, his tiny paws skimming over the forest floor as he explored. "Don't go too far," Samuel called after him, his voice tinged with worry. Rusty paused, his ears twitching before he chirped in response. He trotted back to Samuel's side, nuzzling against his leg as if to reassure him. Samuel smiled, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "Good boy," he murmured. They continued deeper into the woods, the trees closing in around them. Samuel's unease grew with each step, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. He didn't know what he was expecting to find. Another fox, maybe, or something worse, but the tension in his chest refused to ease. When they reached the edge of the brook, Samuel stopped, crouching down to let Rusty drink from the cool, clear water. The little fox lapped eagerly, his tail wagging behind him. But then, a sound broke the silence. A sharp snap of a twig, too loud to be accidental. Samuel froze, his heart pounding as he straightened and turned toward the sound. Rusty's ears perked up, his body tensing as he chirped softly. "Hello," Samuel called, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "Is someone there?" For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. It was the wild fox. Samuel's breath caught in his throat as the sleek creature emerged, its amber eyes locking onto Rusty. The wild fox barked softly, its body low to the ground as it inched closer. Rusty chirped in response, his small frame trembling as he stepped toward the other fox. Samuel's chest tightened with panic. "Rusty, no," he said quickly, reaching out to grab him. But Rusty hesitated, his wide eyes flicking between Samuel and the wild fox. It was as if he was caught in a tug-of-war, torn between the bond he shared with Samuel and the call of the wild. "Rusty," Samuel said again, his voice soft but firm. "Come back to me." The wild fox barked once more, its tone sharper, more commanding. Rusty whimpered, his tiny body trembling as he took a cautious step forward. Samuel's heart sank. He could feel the bond between them stretching thin, like a thread about to snap. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Don't go." For a moment, everything hung in the balance. The wild fox stood still, its amber eyes glinting with something unreadable. Rusty chirped again, his wide eyes flicking back to Samuel. And then, with a small, decisive hop, Rusty turned and bounded back to Samuel's side. Relief washed over Samuel like a wave, his knees nearly giving out as he scooped Rusty into his arms. The wild fox barked one last time before retreating into the shadows, its sleek form disappearing among the trees. Samuel held Rusty close, his chest heaving as he buried his face in the fox's soft fur. "You scared me," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't ever do that again." Rusty let out a soft chirp, nuzzling against Samuel's neck as if to apologize. When they returned home, Samuel's mother was waiting for them on the porch. She took one look at Samuel's pale face and the way he clutched Rusty to his chest, and her expression softened with concern. "What happened?" she asked, stepping forward. Samuel hesitated, his gaze dropping to Rusty. "The wild fox," he said quietly. "It came back." His mother's brow furrowed, but she didn't press for details. Instead, she reached out to stroke Rusty's fur, her touch gentle. "You're safe now," she said, her voice steady. "That's all that matters." Samuel nodded, his grip on Rusty tightening slightly. He didn't say it out loud, but in that moment he made a silent vow. He would do whatever it took to protect Rusty, no matter what. The following days passed in a haze of watchfulness and quiet determination. Samuel stayed closer to home, reluctant to venture too far into the woods with Rusty. Though the fox seemed content exploring the yard, Samuel couldn't shake the lingering fear of another encounter with the wild fox, or worse, of Rusty feeling compelled to follow it next time. Rusty, for his part, seemed blissfully unaware of Samuel's growing tension. He spent his mornings basking in patches of sunlight near the porch and his afternoons chasing butterflies across the yard. He had even grown bolder around the chickens, though Samuel had to remind him not to nip at their feathers. "You're a menace sometimes, you know that?" Samuel said with a laugh one afternoon as Rusty darted away from a squawking hen. The little fox chirped in response, his tail wagging mischievously. Samuel couldn't help but smile. Rusty's antics, his boundless energy and curiosity, brought a lightness to Samuel's days that hadn't been there before. But even as he laughed, a part of him remained on edge, always scanning the treeline for movement, always listening for the faint rustle of leaves that might signal trouble. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Samuel sat on the porch with Rusty curled up beside him. The air was cool and still, the faint scent of pine lingering in the breeze. Samuel's mother was inside, humming softly as she prepared dinner, the warm glow of the kitchen window casting long shadows across the yard. Samuel leaned back against the porch railing, his gaze drifting to the forest beyond. It was beautiful in the fading light, the trees silhouetted against the orange and pink hues of the sunset. But to Samuel, it also felt like a boundary, a line between the safety of home and the unpredictable wild. Rusty stirred beside him, letting out a soft chirp as he nuzzled against Samuel's leg. The boy smiled, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "You're happy here, aren't you?" he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Rusty blinked up at him, his amber eyes glinting in the fading light. He chirped again, his tiny body pressing closer as if to say, "Of course I am." Samuel sighed, his smile fading slightly. "I just wish I knew for sure," he admitted. Sometimes I wonder if you'd be happier out there. With your own kind. The thought made his chest tighten. The idea of letting Rusty go almost too painful to bear. But he couldn't ignore the question that lingered in the back of his mind. Was he holding Rusty back from the life he was meant to live? Rusty chirped softly, his nose nudging against Samuel's hand. The boy glanced down, his gaze meeting Rusty's. In that moment, the connection between them felt unshakable. A bond forged through trust and love. "Maybe we'll figure it out together," Samuel said softly. But the question of where Rusty truly belonged wouldn't wait for long. A few nights later, Samuel was jolted awake by a sound outside his window. A sharp bark, followed by the rustle of leaves. His heart leapt into his throat as he scrambled out of bed, his bare feet hitting the wooden floor. Rusty was already at the window, his body tense and alert as he stared into the darkness beyond. Samuel crossed the room in a few quick strides, his hand resting on Rusty's back as he peered outside. At first, he saw nothing, just the faint outlines of trees swaying in the night breeze. But then, a movement caught his eye. The wild fox was back. It stood at the edge of the yard, its sleek form illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. Its amber eyes were fixed on the house, its body low and tense as it let out another bark. Rusty chirped softly, his ears twitching as he pressed closer to the window. Samuel's chest tightened, a mix of fear and anger surging through him. He wasn't going to let the wild fox take Rusty away, not after everything they'd been through. Without thinking, Samuel grabbed his boots and pulled them on, his movements quick and determined. He scooped Rusty into his arms and made his way down the stairs, his heart pounding as he stepped out onto the porch. The night air was cool against his skin, the yard bathed in silver light. The wild fox barked again, its tone sharp and commanding. Rusty stirred in Samuel's arms, his small body trembling with a mix of fear and curiosity. "You're not taking him," Samuel said firmly, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "He's not yours." The wild fox tilted its head, its amber eyes glinting in the moonlight. It barked once more, its body inching closer to the edge of the yard. Rusty let out a soft chirp, his gaze flicking between the wild fox and Samuel. For a moment, it felt as though time had stopped, the air between them heavy with unspoken tension. But then Samuel made his choice. He set Rusty down gently, his hands trembling as he knelt beside him. "You have to decide, Rusty," he said, his voice breaking. "I can't make this choice for you." Rusty blinked up at him, his wide eyes filled with something Samuel couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or confusion. He chirped softly, his small frame quivering as he turned to face the wild fox. The other fox barked again, its tone insistent. Rusty took a hesitant step forward, his ears twitching as he moved closer to the treeline. Samuel's heart ached as he watched, his chest tightening with every step Rusty took. He wanted to call out, to beg him to come back, but he held his tongue. This was Rusty's decision, and he had to respect it. Rusty paused just before the edge of the yard, his small body silhouetted against the darkness of the forest. The wild fox stood a few feet away, its amber eyes watching him intently. And then, Rusty turned back. With a small, decisive chirp, he darted back to Samuel's side, his tiny body pressing against the boy's leg. Relief and joy flooded through Samuel as he scooped Rusty into his arms, holding him close. "I knew you'd come back," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I knew it." The wild fox let out one final bark before disappearing into the shadows, its sleek form swallowed by the forest. Samuel stood there for a long moment, the weight of the night settling over him. Rusty nuzzled against his chest, his soft fur warm against Samuel's skin. "You're my family," Samuel murmured, his voice steady. "And I'm yours." The morning after the encounter with the wild fox, Samuel awoke to the soft sound of chirping. For a moment, he lay still, his body heavy with the weight of the previous night's events. But then he heard the tiny patter of paws on the wooden floor, and his eyes fluttered open. Rusty was perched by the window, his tail swishing contentedly as he watched the forest beyond. Samuel smiled faintly, the sight of the little fox filling him with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in days. Rusty had made his choice, and he had chosen to stay. That thought alone was enough to ease the ache in Samuel's chest. "You're up early," Samuel murmured, sitting up and rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Rusty chirped in response, his ears twitching as he turned to face Samuel. The boy chuckled softly, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. "Come on, let's get some breakfast." The morning passed in a blur of familiar routines. Rusty darted around the kitchen as Samuel's mother prepared breakfast, his tiny paws skidding on the floor as he chased after a stray piece of thread from her apron. Samuel couldn't help but laugh as he watched, his heart swelling with affection. "You'd think he was part dog the way he follows you around," his mother teased, her eyes glinting with amusement. Samuel grinned, reaching down to scoop Rusty into his arms. "He's just loyal," he said, scratching behind the fox's ears. Rusty let out a soft purr, nuzzling against Samuel's neck. But even as they laughed and played, the events of the previous night lingered in Samuel's mind. He couldn't stop thinking about the wild fox, about the way it had called to Rusty as if it had some claim over him. The encounter had made one thing clear: their bond would always be tested, and Samuel had to be ready. That afternoon, Samuel set to work building a small enclosure in the yard. It wasn't meant to confine Rusty, but to provide him with a safe space where he could play without the constant threat of predators or the pull of the forest. Samuel's mother helped, bringing tools and offering guidance as he measured and hammered. "You're really putting a lot of thought into this," she said, watching as Samuel carefully secured the mesh to the wooden frame. Samuel nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I just want him to be safe," he said simply. His mother placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression soft. "You're doing a good job, Samuel. Rusty's lucky to have you." Samuel smiled faintly, her words filling him with a quiet sense of pride. He glanced over at Rusty, who was sprawled out on the porch, his tail flicking lazily as he watched them work. "I'm the lucky one," Samuel murmured. By the time the enclosure was finished, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. Samuel stood back to admire his work, his chest swelling with a mix of pride and relief. The enclosure was sturdy, with plenty of space for Rusty to run and explore. It even had a small shelter in one corner, lined with soft blankets for when he wanted to rest. "Well," Samuel said, turning to Rusty with a grin. "What do you think?" Rusty chirped excitedly, his tail wagging as he darted into the enclosure. He sniffed at the corners, his tiny paws patting across the soft grass as he explored every inch. Samuel laughed, his heart swelling at the sight of Rusty's joy. "He loves it," his mother said, her voice warm. Samuel nodded, his gaze never leaving Rusty. "Yeah," he said softly, "I think he does." But as the days turned into weeks, Samuel began to notice a change in Rusty. The little fox was as playful as ever, darting around the yard and chirping happily whenever Samuel was near. But there were moments, brief, fleeting moments, when Samuel would catch Rusty staring at the forest with a look in his eyes that made his chest tighten. It wasn't longing exactly, but it was something close to it. Samuel tried to push the thought aside, telling himself that Rusty was happy where he was. But the truth lingered, unspoken and undeniable. Rusty was still a wild animal at heart, and no matter how strong their bond was, Samuel couldn't ignore the part of Rusty that yearned for the freedom of the forest. The realization hit him one crisp autumn afternoon, as he and Rusty played near the edge of the yard. The leaves had turned to vibrant shades of red and gold, the air cool and sharp with the scent of pine. Rusty was chasing a fallen leaf, his tiny body darting back and forth as the wind carried it across the ground. Samuel watched with a smile, his hands tucked into his pockets as he leaned against the fence. But then Rusty stopped suddenly, his ears twitching as he turned toward the forest. His body tensed, his tail stilling as he stared into the trees. "What is it, buddy?" Samuel asked, stepping closer. Rusty chirped softly, his gaze fixed on something Samuel couldn't see. The boy followed his gaze, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the faint silhouette of the wild fox standing just beyond the tree line. it was back. The wild fox stood just beyond the treeline, its sleek form partially hidden by the shadows of the forest. Its amber eyes glinted in the fading light as it watched Rusty intently. Samuel's chest tightened, his body tensing as he stepped forward, instinctively placing himself between Rusty and the fox. Rusty let out a soft chirp, his tail flicking as he glanced between Samuel and the wild fox. There was no fear in his eyes, only curiosity. Samuel clenched his fists, the memory of their last encounter flooding back with a force that left him breathless. "You don't belong here," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the knot of fear in his chest. "Go back where you came from." The wild fox tilted its head, its ears twitching at the sound of his voice. For a moment, it seemed to consider him, its body low to the ground as if deciding whether to advance or retreat. Then, with a soft bark, it took a step closer. Rusty stirred at Samuel's feet, his small frame trembling with an emotion Samuel couldn't quite place. The boy knelt down, his hand resting on Rusty's back as he whispered, "Stay with me, buddy. Please." Rusty chirped softly, his wide eyes flicking back to Samuel. But the wild fox barked again, sharper this time, its tone commanding. Rusty's ears twitched, his body shifting slightly as if drawn toward the sound. Samuel's heart ached as he watched Rusty struggle, caught between two worlds. He wanted to call out, to beg him to stay, but he knew it wasn't his choice to make. Rusty had to decide for himself. "Whatever you choose," Samuel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll always love you." Rusty let out another chirp, his small frame quivering as he turned toward the wild fox. For a moment, Samuel thought he might go, his chest tightening with the weight of impending loss. But then Rusty paused. He turned back to Samuel, his wide eyes meeting the boy's. In that moment, there was no hesitation, no doubt. Rusty chirped once more, a soft, melodic sound, and darted back to Samuel's side. Samuel scooped him up, his arms wrapping around the little fox as relief and love flooded through him. "You came back," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You chose me." The wild fox let out a low growl, its amber eyes narrowing as it watched them. But it didn't advance. Instead, it turned and disappeared into the forest, its sleek form vanishing among the trees. Samuel stood there for a long moment, holding Rusty close as the weight of the encounter settled over him. The forest seemed quieter now, the shadows less threatening. Rusty nuzzled against his chest, his soft fur warm and familiar. "You're my family," Samuel murmured, his voice steady. "And I'm yours." That evening, Samuel and Rusty sat on the porch, the cool breeze carrying the scent of pine and fallen leaves. The little fox was curled up on Samuel's lap, his tiny body rising and falling with each breath. Samuel's mother stepped out onto the porch, a steaming mug of tea in her hands. "You all right?" she asked, her voice soft. Samuel nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think so." His mother sat beside him, her eyes drifting to Rusty. "He's a special one," she said, her tone thoughtful. "Not many would have come back after what he's been through." Samuel smiled faintly, his hand resting on Rusty's back. "He's more than special," he said. "He's brave, loyal. I don't know what I'd do without him." His mother placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and reassuring. "You've done a good job taking care of him," she said. "And he's taken care of you, too." Samuel glanced down at Rusty, his heart swelling with love for the little fox who had become so much more than a pet. "Yeah," he said softly. "He has." The days that followed were some of the happiest Samuel could remember. Rusty seemed more playful than ever, darting around the yard with boundless energy. He chased butterflies, explored every corner of the enclosure Samuel had built, and even ventured into the barn to help with the chores. Samuel's mother often watched them with a smile, her heart warmed by the bond between her son and the fox. She had seen Samuel grow in ways she hadn't expected, becoming more patient, more responsible, more compassionate. Rusty had brought out the best in him, and for that, she was endlessly grateful. But the shadow of the wild fox lingered, a reminder that their bond would always be tested. One crisp autumn morning, as Samuel and Rusty played near the edge of the yard, a sharp sound broke the peace. A bark, unmistakable and close. Samuel's heart sank as he turned toward the forest. His worst fears realized. The wild fox was back. And this time it wasn't alone. Two more foxes stood beside it, their sleek forms low to the ground as they stared at Samuel and Rusty. Their amber eyes glinted with something primal, something dangerous. Samuel's breath caught in his throat, his body tensing as he stepped in front of Rusty. "Stay back," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. The wild fox barked again, its tone sharp and commanding. Rusty chirped softly, his small frame quivering as he pressed against Samuel's leg. Samuel clenched his fists, his mind racing as he tried to think of what to do. He couldn't let them take Rusty. Not now, not ever. "Go away," he shouted, his voice echoing through the yard. "You're not taking him." The wild fox tilted its head, its amber eyes narrowing. For a moment, the tension was suffocating, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken threats. But then, something changed. Rusty stepped forward. Samuel's heart skipped a beat as the little fox moved past him, his small frame trembling but his head held high. He chirped softly, his wide eyes fixed on the wild fox as if to say, "I'm not afraid of you." The wild fox barked again, its tone sharp and insistent, but Rusty didn't flinch. He chirped once more, louder this time, his voice carrying a note of defiance. The standoff lasted only seconds, but to Samuel, it felt like an eternity. The wild fox stared at Rusty, its body low and tense, before letting out a low growl. Slowly, it turned and retreated into the forest, its companions following close behind. Samuel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his knees nearly giving out as he sank to the ground. Rusty chirped softly, trotting back to his side as if nothing had happened. "You're braver than I'll ever be," Samuel whispered, scooping Rusty into his arms. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Rusty nuzzled against his chest, his soft fur warm and familiar. And in that moment, Samuel knew one thing for certain. No matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together.